in this moment of data consumption, we tend to be exposed to information that is a confirmation bias, where we only see information that articulates our point of view. Algorithms that exist cause that to happen. And so we are less, particularly young people, are less comfortable being exposed to divergent points of view. And our human nature in a lot of ways is to be tribal and stay with people who agree with us. And the challenge is when mom and dad, who you have to live with, don't agree, what happens. And I would say that our societal, and when I say societal, I mean, here in the United States, our muscles for conversations across lines of difference have atrophied in a lot of ways. And when a muscle atrophies, it gets lazy, and the instinct is to do the least amount of work. And the least amount of work is to reject, to be reductive, and to attack a straw man, or to just ignore. Deeper understanding takes a lot more effort, and we are not in shape a lot of the times for that effort. But a good place to make your children in shape for the effort of engaging across lines of difference is around that metaphorical dinner table.
Hi, I'm Rachel Green, Brooklyn-based divorce mediator and collaborative attorney, and this is my podcast, Keep the Kids in Mind. Join me as I chat with other industry professionals about everything from smoothly navigating your way through divorce to prenups, all the while keeping the kids in mind. Hi, I'm Rachel Green, a mediator and collaborative attorney, and this is my podcast, Keep the Kids in Mind. Today, I'm very pleased to have a second episode with Cara Raich, who is a former mediator who now is working in pre-divorce counseling to help people who are contemplating divorce choose what process they want to restructure their family using. And lately, Cara, I know that you have been doing work outside of the family and divorce arena. And I'm wondering if you would like to share with our audience what you're doing and what led you to be doing that kind of work.
Hi, I'm so excited to be back for a second episode. So after around a decade or so of doing family and divorce mediation, I started to wonder if some of the skills that we use to do our work in mediation and that we teach our clients to use to help them in conflicted moments in their life, if that's applicable in other arenas. And so I started to bring that skill set to workplaces, to institutional spaces and organizations, to help groups of people have productive, transformative conversations about challenging topics. And what animated the shift is our popular culture and our country has been going through a lot of tumult in a lot of different cultural arenas, from political to gender dynamics to racial dynamics to all kinds of different political matters. And so I started to wonder, what if we imagine talking to each other differently? And so I started to embark on that work.
That's so interesting, because we really are at a time where there's a lot of conflict in the world and a lot of personal challenges that people are going through. And one thing I was thinking about is trying to find ways to guide families who are having conflict, around the holiday dinner table or just in their homes, where I think that there is different generations see things differently, and it's a time when people are struggling with the conflict in the world, and it's sort of bleeding into the home and family life.
I don't know what you're talking about. What kind of family conflict could there possibly be around the dinner table right now? You're right. And as the world, we have been through tumultuous years. The folks who were growing up during these tumultuous years have had a different experience than their parents. And there are a lot of things that have, being a parent myself, and I know you are too, the way that we grew up, in many ways, we cannot relate to the way our children are growing up. When we grew up, there was no internet, and they grew up with, so the way that information flows, the way that we consume information, the way that we experience the world is radically different than the way that our children do. And by children, I also mean young adults. And so necessarily, we are taking in the events of the world differently. And the lens through which older people and younger people are looking at some of the conflicts in the world is different. And so it's not surprising to me that we're hearing reports of elevated family dynamic challenges during these moments of conflict.
Yeah. It's important to try to keep the lines of communication open. I am just a big fan of Esther Perel. I don't know if you've listened to any of her podcasts.
I have, yeah.
But she talked about this a few weeks ago. And she was talking about, I think she was talking to, it was her interview with Trevor Noah. And she was saying that in her household, when she was growing up, people had different political outlooks, and maybe partly their own choices, partly because of their ages. But they were really very starkly different. And they could have arguments, political arguments, but then they would all sit down to dinner together and they still felt like they loved each other. And it seems like we've lost, or maybe we never developed the tools to have a conflict with someone and yet still keep your heart open.
I think you're right. I would say that there's so many things I could respond to what you said, but I think given the subject matter of this podcast and the centering of the reason, I think you didn't say this, but I'm imagining the reason you center children in your podcast and in your work is because most people who are going through divorce, who are parents, want to do what is best for their children. And we know from our psychological research and data that low conflict divorces and low conflict families are most beneficial to children. And so the question is, in this moment of elevated conflict, are families becoming more conflicted places and battlegrounds for arguments? And if they are, what are the things that people can do? What are the causes? I think I'm curious about the causes, and also what is the thing that families can do to deactivate themselves and have productive conversations, resting on the foundation of their love for each other, and still sit down and say, pass the potatoes, instead of using an expletive before they say that. So I think a few things. One is that in this moment of data consumption, we tend to be exposed to information that is a confirmation bias, where we only see information that articulates our point of view. Algorithms that exist cause that to happen. And so we are less, particularly young people, are less comfortable being exposed to divergent points of view. And our human nature in a lot of ways is to be tribal and stay with people who agree with us. And the challenge is when mom and dad, who you have to live with, don't agree, what happens. And I would say that our societal, and when I say societal, I mean, here in the United States, our muscles for conversations across lines of difference have atrophied in a lot of ways. And when a muscle atrophies, it gets lazy, and the instinct is to do the least amount of work. And the least amount of work is to reject, to be reductive, and to attack a straw man, or to just ignore. Deeper understanding takes a lot more effort, and we are not in shape a lot of the times for that effort. But a good place to make your children in shape for the effort of engaging across lines of difference is around that metaphorical dinner table. And so the question is, how do we do that? And it's hard.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. My daughter Lydia is very politically active, and she took a training in something called deep canvassing.
Mm-hmm.
And the theory of deep canvassing is very, it really resonated with me being a mediator. The principles all made sense to me. They started out by saying people are only convinced by the words that come out of their own mouths. So arguing with somebody is only going to make them more defensive and reactive, and they'll just dig in harder and say, no, you're wrong and I'm right, and I have to let you see, I have to make you understand how wrong you are. And then if two people are saying, but you don't get it, you're wrong, no, you don't get it, you're wrong, you're sort of and you're not moving anywhere. And instead, deep canvassing uses techniques that we use in mediation, saying, that's so interesting that you see it that way. Can you tell me more about your thoughts? What brought you to that point of view? What do you think will be the consequences if everyone in the country believed what you believe? Where do you think that would take us? Is that a place you want to go? Are there other paths you can think of for how we can get there? What in your personal life led you to feel that that's the best approach? That you just ask questions and listen.
So there's a lot of wisdom in that, which I think folks like you and me who engage people who are in conflict understand that the technique of asking questions matters. Our community organizing friends would say personal stories matter a lot. People are not inherently irrational. There are reasons that they think what they think. Most of the time, not always. Nothing's absolute, right? And there's always exceptions. And what I would say, I think what's missing, and it would be a radical shame if what I'm about to say also extends to families, but there is an empathy gap in our country right now where we engage with each other in what I would call destructive winning, with destructive winning in mind. Where winning an argument means eviscerating the other person, erasing them, shaming them, canceling them and their ideas instead of being curious. And so I guess the antidote in some ways to the empathy gap is what you are describing. When I do this work, my partner and I, we have and no disrespect to our religious friends, but we have a trinity of ideas that we like to use, which is empathy, humility, and curiosity. And imagine, just like the deep canvassers, if we engaged in conversations from a place of humility. Maybe I don't know everything about this topic, or I'm certainly not an expert in your life experience. With empathy, we like to tell people that empathy is not a scarce resource. You can be very empathetic and it doesn't harm your position or delete your position in any way. And understanding does not equal agreement.
Right.
But
That's great.
What if we approached each other with an internal agenda, not to shift the other person and quote unquote win the argument, but to understand their perspective differently? Our thesis is it will expand empathy and we will see each other with more humanity. And of course, that matters in this moment of very elevated conflict because dehumanization can lead to violence. And we know many stories throughout history. And I'm not saying that people are beating each other up around the dinner table, but our psychologist colleagues tell us that psychological safety and physical safety, our bodies have a very similar physiological response to both. And it's very scary and uncomfortable to sit at the dinner table with your fight or flight instinct fully amped up.
Yeah, that's a good point. And nobody's going to sleep well when that's the kind of dinner that they had with their family.
That is not to suggest that there shouldn't be disagreement. I am a how person. And so I would say how we disagree matters very much, especially in a family.
Yeah. So it sounds like it comes down to whether people are willing to listen to someone else's point of view, even when they don't agree.
This is very hard. When you ask somebody, listening is not a noun, it's a verb. You have to do a thing when you listen. And sometimes
I like that.
It's true.
Yeah.
And when you're in a social conversation, like the one we're having, it's possible that what's happening in your brain is you are listening to respond. You're listening to say, that reminds me of the time I went to the place and did the thing. But in these kinds of highly dynamic conversations, what if we shifted to the economist who unfortunately just passed away, Daniel Kahneman, would call system 2 thinking, where we elevate our awareness and we kick into gear our thoughtfulness muscles. And what we're doing intentionally when we're listening is we're seeking to deeply understand and not respond. And so what we're thinking about is, I think I heard you say X. Is that right? And actually seek to understand and know in our hearts that I could think what you are saying is bananas. All I want to do is understand it differently. And what if, on the aggregate, I'm imagining, because I'm a dreamer in some ways, what if we did that collectively, where we engage deeply? Can we fix that empathy gap? Can we see each other with more humanity and with more kindness and with more understanding and with more empathy?
Yeah. And
I don't know.
it's so interesting because I'm thinking about Trump and what a divisive character he is. And when he first came on the you know into the media, into awareness, I don't mean like with The Apprentice. I mean when he first entered politics, there was a lot of talk of the forgotten working class white man. And I think that at that point, I certainly, I'm a New York Jewish liberal, but I certainly could have empathy for the for a person whose livelihood vanished, his ability to support himself and his family vanished, and he's struggling financially and feels completely forgotten by society. That was a character who I could empathize with. But now, over time, it's become so starkly oppositional. You're either a liberal or you're a conservative. Liberals think A, B, C, D, E, and conservatives think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and never the twain shall meet. And we've lost track of the stories that can arouse empathy in each other. I mean, ultimately, I think we all want the same things. We all want to have a decent life. We want to be able to support our children. We want to have, a decent place to live. We want to have enough food to eat. I mean, there's basic ways that we want decent schools. We want decent libraries. We want cultural things available. I mean, really, American life, I don't think we're so divided in the vision of what it should be, but the media has somehow categorized us and divided us, and then we don't get underneath those positions. Like everything I just said was about the positions, and then you listen and you listen to the news or watch the news, and it gets your hackles up.
So I think this is a dynamic that we're all living with. The lenses through which the way that we consume information in our various media bubbles or in our algorithms or whatever is creates a situation where it is very difficult. Nuance often gets erased, and so that heart space, that the way that we can see each other from a heart space, it kind of erodes empathy, the way that we are given information in a lot of ways, not always, and with deep respect to people in media who don't do that, and not everyone does that, but not looking at things from a level of reductive simplicity requires effort. It requires deeper reading. It takes longer, and we've trained ourselves to read tweets, not New Yorker length articles. And so there's that, but then there's also the idea that maybe what we have in common is more than we think. President Biden often talks about what we have in common as Americans. But I also think it's important, the last few years have taught us that not all Americans have experienced America the same way. And we have to elevate our awareness to the fact that not that we all are experts in our own lives and not necessarily in each other's. And we need to be curious from a genuine place about what it is that other people experience. I think that that would help sort of create a little bit of empathy. And of course, on a lot of the political stuff in our country, I'm going to go slightly off topic. So, if you take almost any political issue that we have in our country, it comes down to a lot of the time a lack of agreement between the parties that you mentioned, sort of the liberal versus conservative, which is a very binary way to look at things. But it's really a conversation about the role of government and what do we think the role of government is in some of these calamities that people face. And I think there's deep disagreement in our country around what that role might be.
But that's interesting because then it means that when people are arguing about immigration or abortion or gun control, they're not really arguing about what they're really arguing about.
Well, right. And those very polarizing topics, which we're not going to get into that the substantive debate here, but those are topics that touch a lot of different components of our life experience and identities, and we end up having very binary fights about them. And in the end, we are disagreeing about the intervention that the government will have in those matters. So that's why I think the role of government would be an interesting conversation to have with people who can influence the role of government, like how our political conversations happen, particularly around, well, actually all of them. All of them are really a role of government conversation.
But then what if there's an essential disagreement about the role of government that also breaks down across party lines?
I think that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And, again, being a how person and not a what person, I would say that how we engage, take a page from the deep canvassers. What do you think would happen if your position became the law of the land? And how do you think people would experience that policy shift is a really interesting, thoughtful way to have the conversation. And I think that we can attack ideas and policies, but what we have to stop doing, I think, and it's really hard, I think we have to stop attacking each other as people and modeling an engagement that is, you hearkened back to the good old days where people had political debates and then had dinner. But can we get to a place where that's actually true? And that's a wondering. I don't know. But when parents and children are having these deep arguments, are they disputing each other's positions and thinking, or does it become ad hominem and does it become about the individuals? I hope not, but I think sometimes it really does. And certainly the modeling in the Twitterverse or on in popular culture is definitely ad hominem. And we have very huge national leaders who are models of engaging in ad hominem attacks. And so I think from a family perspective, maybe there could be some ground rules and some guideposts for having these hard conversations. Even in a family, it might sound artificial, but there are things that folks can do to turn a conversation into dialogue and not just advocacy.
So I guess we've touched on some of the tools. One would be to say, why do you think this? How did you come to think this?
Right. I would call those curious questions.
Curious questions, right? So that's one thing that you can do.
Another thing that you can do, and this happens all the time, where when you're particularly in a group dialogue, like a family conversation, there are some things, they're conflict traps that are in the room with us, things, dynamics that lend us to fall into confirmation or consensus biases. An example would be, well, everyone knows that, blah, 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 instead of, I think, and the proverbial we can cause a lot of harm in a group dialogue. And so defining we is another technique. And
what do you mean by defining we? Can you add a little?
Yeah. I am imagining, let's imagine a fictional workplace dispute. Okay. Staff versus management, non-union. Don't yell at me, everybody. We're not talking about a union shop, but just a business that's not a union shop, where a staff person stands up and says, we all think blah, blah, blah. And it's the loudest voice. And speaking for everybody, without actually confirming that that is what everybody thinks. And so if we could say, I think, and then the next person can say, well, I think some of that, but I actually think a little bit of this too. Where part of a good conversation or a mediative intervention is not necessarily only coming to a solution, but it's also defining parameters of disagreement with specificity.
I see.
Say,
So
we all
you're being more specific when you say I think than when you
right,
say you think.
right, because you could get it wrong. And I mean, sometimes people do speak for groups of people. Of course, that happens. But in a family, to be thoughtful about being reductive inadvertently.
I
Mean
think,
and
however,
else.
I think that when people bring someone else in, usually it's because of insecurity, and they need to triangulate. They need to bring a third person into the. Well, I was talking to your sister, and she agrees with me
Ah,
that that you are wrong on this issue.
and it could be true that that
The
happened, but
sister's not sitting in. It could be true, but the sister's not there in mediation. The sister might not want you to rat her out to her brother.
well, this is so in families when these conversations happen, those of our colleagues who study family systems know that like that family dynamic is in the room with you too, and families are experts at each other's dances. When I do this, you do that, then I say this, and you always, and all of that stuff. And so the question becomes, when you bring these highly polarizing issues, whether it's the conflagration in the Middle East or it's a reproductive justice conversation here at home, are we thinking about the how when we talk about these matters with our family? And the answer is probably not that often. And so you can cause harm within families, and power dynamics in families are complicated. And so I guess my pitch would be, before you start, maybe talk about how you're going to talk a little bit and then do it.
That's a great idea. I mean, I don't know if people would take the time to sit down and do that, but to say, I want to understand how you're thinking about this, and I want us to try to have a conversation without screaming.
And I want the courtesy of being listened to in return.
Right.
I want us to be curious about each other's views. I want us to have empathy for how each other is experiencing each other's views.
And one part of that is please talk about what you think, don't tell me what your whole political party thinks. Don't tell me how you and the neighbor up the block think. Just we can only talk about our own experience
and our own perspectives, and do it with, if it's appropriate. I mean, family relationships are obviously complicated, but often we forget to predicate our remarks on the love that we feel for each other in a family, especially when we're angry. It's so easy to go to, often they say, those who you love the most, you can hurt the most. But there's, because you're comfortable in family settings, sometimes we're careless with our words. And words matter, and how we care for each other matters. And so this is true whether it's a group of friends sitting around a table or family members sitting around a table. I urge people to think about what it means to win that argument.
Yeah, is a good point. I was just thinking about the feeling of winning. What does that mean when you're talking to your uncle or your father or your sibling? Is there really a win-lose in this conversation, or is there just sharing ideas and increasing understanding?
Look, we are trained both in our political models, Democrat, Republican, to be very binary. And binary,
and as lawyers.
Right, well, right. There's the plaintiff and the defendant, right? And
there's a winner and loser in court.
And there's a winner and a loser. And so I guess the work, and it's an ongoing project, I think, is, can we, binary arguments are simple and they provide simple comfort. And the morality is very clear, right? Yes, no, pro, con, it's simple. And so once the nuance comes in, the question is, can we sort of hone that muscle to be very curious about each other? We can still disagree, but does it have to be hateful? And what if the winning meant I came away with a different or greater understanding of the other person? And I have certainly been asked many times, what is the point? Like, really, what's the point of that? And the point is, we are at a precipice in our country where political discourse has become increasingly ugly, and divisive, and we are seeing moments of violence. And if we saw each other with more empathy and compassion, the peacemaker in me wonders if that might shift. And if the answer is no, it could not shift, and you're completely impractical and you don't know what you're talking about, Cara, and like grow up and this is the world, I would say you all do you, but I'm going to lean into empathy, compassion, curiosity, and wondering about what it is that makes somebody else feel differently about an issue than me.
Well, as a fellow peacemaker, I agree with you 100%. So you won.
There you go. Hashtag winning. Yeah, look, this stuff's really complicated. It's really hard, and I have empathy for every family who is in conflict over political matters. I think you and I both, we see you, and we feel for you, and we hope that some of the techniques that we shared can help you around your dinner table.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us here on keeping the kids in mind. Certainly having new tools for discussing and resolving conflict and lowering conflict in the home will help the kids come through the family transitions more smoothly. And that's probably the best way that parents can keep their kids in mind. Thank you very much, Cara Raich. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.